The morning Ethan Walker drove his father's old pickup down the gravel road toward home, the sky above the Iowa flatlands was the color of a bruise, deep purple along the horizon, pale and exhausted at the edges, as if the land itself had been holding its breath for too long. The truck rattled over every familiar bump in the road, and each one felt like a memory pressing up through the floorboards. He hadn't been back in 3 years, not since the funeral, not since he stood beside his mother in the cold November rain and watched them lower his father into the earth of the same county where 3 generations of Walkers had lived, worked, and grown old. He gripped the steering wheel tighter as the farmhouse came into view, white paint fading, the front porch slightly uneven, the old weather vane on the barn roof twisted sideways like it had given up trying to point anywhere at all. But it was still standing, and so was she. Margaret Walker was 61 years old and had the hands of a woman who had never stopped working a single day of her life. She was standing at the edge of the front porch when Ethan pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron the way she always did when she was trying to hold her emotions together. She didn't run to him. She wasn't that kind of woman. She just stood there, watching him step out of the truck, and when he finally walked up and put his arms around her, she held on for a long moment before whispering, "You're too thin." Ethan laughed softly into her shoulder. It was the most honest welcome home he had ever received. He spent the first 2 days simply walking the land. He walked the eastern fields where the corn still grew in reasonable rows. He walked the old creek bed that had narrowed considerably since he was a boy. He walked the southern pasture where 3 aging fence posts leaned into each other like tired old men. And then he walked the western edge of the farm, and that is where he stopped. That is where something in his chest went quiet and heavy. The western boundary, which had once been a gentle natural rise of mixed grasses and prairie shrubs, was now almost completely bare. The wind had stripped it. Years of aggressive cultivation too close to the edge, years of drought cycles, years of losing a little topsoil every single season until the loss was no longer little. He crouched down and lifted a handful of the dry, pale earth. It crumbled between his fingers like ash. His father's soil, his grandfather's soil, blowing away grain by grain into air that didn't belong to them. That evening at the kitchen table, over a supper of pork chops and green beans that Margaret had clearly prepared with great care, Ethan told his mother what he wanted to do. He had spent 4 years studying sustainable agriculture at Iowa State. He had read every paper, every field study, every practical report on windbreak systems and agroforestry. He knew what the western edge needed. It needed trees, not crops, not more bare ground pushed to its limit. Trees, native species, a living windbreak that would slow the prairie wind, anchor the soil, hold moisture, and rebuild what decades of pressure had taken away. Margaret listened carefully, the way she always listened, with her hands folded on the table and her eyes steady. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father always said there was something wrong with that western edge. He just never knew what to do about it." Ethan nodded slowly. "I think I do," he said. The following Monday, he began. He had ordered the saplings weeks before he came home, a carefully selected mix of eastern red cedars, wild plums, chokecherries, and native shrubs like buffalo berry and sand cherry. They arrived on a flatbed truck in small bundles, each one no taller than a man's forearm, looking fragile and almost ridiculous against the scale of the open Iowa sky. Ethan built a planting schedule, marked his rows with stakes and string, and began digging. The soil on the western edge was hard and dry and did not give easily. Every hole required effort. His back ached by noon and burned by evening, but he kept going, one hole, one tree, one day after another. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. In a small rural county, nothing goes unnoticed for long. By the end of the first week, 2 trucks had slowed on the county road to watch him work. By the second week, someone had stopped to ask what he was doing. When Ethan explained, the man, a large, weathered farmer named Dale Hutchins, who had farmed the adjacent land for 40 years, leaned out his truck window, looked at the row of tiny saplings, and said with a short, dismissive laugh, "Trees don't pay bills, son." He said it the way a man says something he believes to be an obvious and permanent truth. Then he drove on. Ethan watched the truck disappear down the road, turned back to his work, and kept digging. The comments continued through the weeks that followed. A group of men at the grain elevator talked about it. Some thought it was a young man's foolish experiment. Others said it more plainly, that he was wasting prime acreage that could be turning a profit. One man said that grief does strange things to people, and said it with just enough sympathy to make it feel like an insult. Margaret heard some of the talk when she went into town for supplies. She never repeated it to Ethan directly, but sometimes in the evenings he could see something tight and tired around her eyes that told him she had heard things she was carrying alone. He never pushed her to speak them aloud. He just made sure supper was on the table when she came home, and he made sure she saw him out there every single morning before the sun was fully up, still planting, still digging, still moving one careful row at a time along the western edge. By the time the last sapling was in the ground, the total count was 437 trees and shrubs stretching nearly a quarter-mile along the farm's western boundary. They looked, honestly, like almost nothing, thin sticks in dry dirt. Margaret stood beside him on the evening of the last planting day and looked at the row in silence for a long time. "They look so small," she finally said. Ethan nodded. "They do," he said honestly, "but they're alive." He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who has done his research, made his decision, and chosen to trust what he cannot yet see. Margaret looked at him sideways in the fading light, and in her expression was something between worry and pride that only a mother who has watched her child choose a difficult and uncertain path can truly feel. The first year was hard. The saplings needed water through a dry summer, and Ethan rigged a simple drip irrigation line along the windbreak rows, pulling water from the farm's secondary well. He nursed each plant through the heat, removing competing weeds by hand, checking for disease, adjusting the irrigation carefully. The corn in the eastern fields that season produced an average yield, nothing remarkable, nothing terrible, enough to cover the season's operating costs and leave a modest margin. It was the kind of year that doesn't make a farmer feel hopeful, but keeps him going. That was enough for now. By the second year, the saplings had begun to establish. Their root systems, invisible underground but real and reaching, were quietly beginning to anchor the pale western soil. The plants themselves were still modest in height, knee to waist high depending on the species, but they were growing with a steadiness that gave Ethan deep satisfaction. He walked the windbreak row every morning the way other men walked their fence lines. He knew each plant by its position and its character. He noticed which ones were thriving and which ones needed attention. He spoke to his mother about them at supper, in the same tone a man might use to speak about children learning to find their footing. The third year brought the first measurable change that went beyond what Ethan had observed alone. The county agricultural extension agent, a methodical woman named Patricia Soule, who drove a state truck and carried a clipboard like a shield, stopped by in late summer and asked if she could walk the windbreak. Ethan walked with her. She took soil samples at 3 points along the western edge and compared them to baseline samples from a field study she had been conducting in the county. When she looked up from her clipboard, she said, "Your organic matter content here is already improving. That's faster than I would have expected."
Ethan didn't say much in response, but after she left, he sat on the tailgate of his father's truck for a long while and looked at the trees, now clearly trees, no longer sticks, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. By the 4th year, the windbreak was doing what windbreaks do when they are properly designed and given time. The air on the western side of the farm moved differently.
Not dramatically, not in any way that a visitor would immediately name, but Ethan felt it in the way the soil behaved after a dry wind came through. It didn't lose its surface the way it once had. Moisture was staying in the ground longer in the fields adjacent to the windbreak. His input costs on the western corn acres were beginning to drop because the soil was holding fertilizer rather than losing it to wind erosion. Songbirds had returned to the farm in numbers that surprised even Margaret, who had grown up with them and missed them without realizing how much. Deer moved through the windbreak at dusk. Pheasants nested in the lower shrubs. The farm was beginning to feel, in some quiet way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss, like a living place again. And then came the 5th year, and with it, the drought. It arrived in late May, and it was merciless, the kind of drought that settles over the land like a lid on a pot, no escape, no relief, week after week of burning sun and wind and soil that turned to powder at the edge of every field. By midsummer, the county was in emergency status. Crop insurance adjusters were driving the roads constantly. At the grain elevator and at the diner on Main Street, the conversations were grim and getting grimmer. Farmers who had been in the business for 30 and 40 years shook their heads and said they hadn't seen anything like it since the 1980s. Dale Hutchins lost nearly 60% of his corn yield that summer. Several other operations in the county reported similar losses. It was the kind of season that breaks men who have built everything on the land's generosity. Ethan's fields did not look the same as his neighbors' fields. The windbreak had changed the microclimate along the western acres in ways that were now undeniable. The soil held moisture longer because the wind was slowed. The root systems of the trees drew water upward through the soil profile in a process that benefited the surrounding crop root zones. His western corn acres, the ones closest to the windbreak, outperformed every other field on the farm and most fields in the county. His total yield loss that season was less than 15%. In a drought year when others were losing half their crops, Ethan harvested enough to cover his costs, pay down a portion of the farm's remaining debt, and keep his mother's home exactly where it had always been, standing on Walker land under an Iowa sky. It was Dale Hutchins who came to see him. Late September, the harvest nearly finished, the air carrying that particular golden heaviness of an Iowa autumn that makes even a hard year feel briefly beautiful. Ethan was walking the windbreak alone when he heard the old truck on the gravel road, and then heard it stop, and then heard the slow, heavy footsteps of a large man crossing the field towards him. He turned and waited. Dale Hutchins was 67 years old that fall, and he walked like a man carrying something that had nothing to do with his body. He stopped a few feet from Ethan and looked at the trees, now tall, full, a genuine windbreak, standing in its 5th year of growth against the Iowa sky, and he was quiet for a long time. "I lost my western acres in 1987, Dale finally said. His voice was low and rough. "Worst wind erosion I ever saw. I planted the edge to corn the very next spring. My father told me that was wrong. He said, put a shelter belt in. He said the land needs a border, a place to breathe." He stopped. He looked at the trees again. I didn't listen to him. I thought he was being old-fashioned. I thought I knew better. His jaw tightened. He died the following winter. We never spoke about it again. Ethan stood very still and let the words come. "I've been looking at these trees of yours," Dale said quietly. "Every time I drove past, I told myself you were making a mistake.
I told myself that because it was easier than remembering that I made one, that I didn't listen to my father when I had the chance. His voice broke on the last word just slightly, and he cleared his throat and looked away toward the distant horizon. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have planted them the same way you did. He didn't know either. Neither did I, not for a long time." Dale looked at him. "You learned," he said. Ethan met his eyes. "You're standing here," he said gently. "That's learning too." The two men stood together beside those living trees for a long while without another word, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that comes when two people have said something true and recognize it as such. It was 3 weeks after that conversation, on a quiet October morning when the maples in the windbreak had turned the color of fire, that Margaret Walker walked out to the trees alone. Ethan watched her from the kitchen window, his coffee cup in his hands, not moving. She walked slowly along the row, the way she walked when she was thinking something through. She ran her hand along the bark of one of the larger cedars, a tree that had been a stick-thin sapling the year Ethan planted it, and now taller than a man and solid to the touch. She stood there with her hand on the bark for a long time. Then she turned and looked back at the farmhouse, and then at the fields, and then at the sky. Ethan set down his coffee and walked out to meet her. When he reached her, she didn't turn right away. She kept her hand on the tree and looked at the long row stretching into the golden morning light. Then she said, quietly and without any performance, "He would have done exactly this." She meant her husband. She meant Ethan's father. 7 words spoken to the open air of a farm that had survived because her son had trusted something he could not yet see. Ethan stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she hadn't that cold November rain at the
funeral, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. The wind moved through the trees with a sound that was gentle now, a sound it had never made on this farm before, because there had been nothing here to slow it, to shape it, to give it a voice worth listening to. Across the county, people were talking about the Walker farm. The Extension Office cited it in a regional sustainability report. 2 younger farmers came to walk the windbreak and ask questions. A journalist from a Des Moines publication drove out and spent an afternoon with Ethan, writing a piece about agroforestry in the Midwest that ran in the spring edition of an agricultural magazine. Dale Hutchins, the following spring, planted a shelter belt along his own western boundary. 600 trees, native species, staked and watered with the same kind of patience he had spent years telling himself he didn't have time for. He called Ethan the evening after the last sapling went in, and the conversation was short and sincere. "First time in 20 years I've done something my father would have approved of," Dale said. Ethan smiled into the phone. "He knows," he said simply. The Walker farm did not become famous. It did not become wealthy overnight. It did not solve every problem that years of loss and sorrow had left in its wake. But it became something perhaps more important than any of those things. It became an example. Quiet, patient, rooted, the way all meaningful things are. Ethan Walker never argued with a single person who told him trees don't pay bills. He never raised his voice. He never sought recognition. He just kept digging, one hole at a time, one tree at a time, one season of faith at a time, until the land itself spoke on his behalf in the language that only those willing to wait long enough can ever truly hear. If this story reached something in you, if it made you think of a parent, a piece of land, a decision you made or didn't make, a word of patience you were given or that you gave, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, where every week we bring you true-to-life tales of quiet courage, family love, and the deep American spirit that never stops planting, never stops believing, and never stops growing. Leave a comment below and tell us what is something you are planting today that the world cannot see yet. We would love to hear from you. What is the significant educational and other value in this story? This story carries real, layered value far beyond its emotional impact. Environmentally, it teaches the science of windbreaks and agroforestry, proven practical methods used by farmers and land managers around the world to combat wind erosion, retain soil moisture, improve crop yields, and restore
biodiversity to working agricultural land. It shows young and old viewers alike that nature-based solutions are not idealism. They are sound, evidence-backed practices that produce measurable results. Psychologically and socially, it models the power of long-term thinking over short-term pressure, the courage required to hold a quiet conviction against community doubt, and the deep redemption available in honest conversation between people who have hurt each other, even unintentionally. Generationally, it honors the wisdom of parents and grandparents while showing how that wisdom can be learned, carried forward, and applied with new knowledge. For family audiences, it offers a portrayal of a mother and son bond built not on grand gestures, but on shared work, shared grief, and shared faith. And culturally, it reflects the enduring values of rural America: land stewardship, community, resilience, and the belief that what you plant with patience and love will, in time, shelter the people who come after you.